The morning Caleb Hurst rode into Redstone, Texas, the whole town stopped breathing. Not because of the horse, though the black stallion was worth more than most men earned in a decade. Not because of the silver-handled colt on his hip, or the tailored coat that spoke of money earned far from the dust and heat of this dying little town. No. They stopped breathing because of who was sitting behind him. Clara Voss. The outcast. The shame. The sister nobody talked about in polite company, and the one everybody whispered about the moment backs were turned. She was pressed against Caleb's back, her dark hair loose and tangled, her dress torn at the shoulder. She held his coat with both hands like she was afraid the earth might swallow her if she let go. And her eyes, when she finally looked up at the crowd gathering on the main street, held something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite victory. It was something colder. Something older. Like she'd already seen how this story ended. People came out of the general store. Out of the saloon. The sheriff stepped off his porch with his thumbs in his belt and the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to reach for a weapon. On the far end of the street, in the window of the grandest house in Redstone, a lace curtain moved. And behind it, partially hidden by shadow, stood Eleanor Voss, Clara's older sister. The celebrated one. The beautiful one. The one a man like Caleb Hurst was supposed to choose. Eleanor had been waiting for Caleb to arrive. She'd spent 3 weeks waiting. But nobody, not Eleanor, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not a single soul in Redstone, had expected him to arrive with Clara. What had happened between them out in those Badlands? And what terrible thing was about to begin? 3 weeks earlier, Redstone was the kind of town that had convinced itself it was thriving. It had a church with a bell that actually rang, a hotel with clean sheets twice a month, and a saloon that served whiskey poured from actual bottles instead of dipped from a barrel. By frontier standards, that was civilization. By any honest standard, it was a collection of sun-bleached wood and broken promises sitting in the middle of nowhere, slowly running out of reasons to exist. The silver mine 3 miles east had been the reason once. The Voss family had worked it, and owned it, and built their house on the hill above it, and for 15 years the mine had given Redstone its heartbeat. But the silver was thinning. Everyone knew it. No one said it. Douglas Voss had said it, once, to his daughters. "We need an alliance," he told them, sitting at the long dining room table with the silver candelabras and the cracked ceiling. He didn't look at Clara when he spoke. He rarely did. His gaze went to Eleanor, always Eleanor, the firstborn, the mirror of her dead mother, the girl whose laugh could fill a room and whose manners could silence one. A man with capital. With connections. Someone who can invest in the mine before the vein runs cold. Eleanor had nodded like she understood exactly what was being asked of her, and had been ready for the asking. Clara had stared at her plate. That had been 6 months ago. Now the name on everyone's lips was Caleb Hurst. He was 29 years old, and the son of a railroad baron from St. Louis who died and left him a fortune large enough to rebuild Redstone 3 times over. He wasn't looking for love, that was the story anyway. He was looking for investment opportunities. Someone had told him about the Voss silver mine, and so he'd written a letter, and Douglas Voss had written back so fast the ink had barely dried before it was sealed and sent. The town prepared like royalty was coming. Eleanor wore her blue dress, the one that matched her eyes, the one she kept in a cedar box, and spent 3 mornings fixing her hair in ways that would appear effortless. The hotel aired out its best room. The saloon stocked better whiskey. Even the sheriff polished his badge, though nobody was quite sure why. Clara wore what she always wore. A plain cotton dress in a color that might once have been green. She did not fix her hair beyond braiding it and pinning it up the way she always did, quick, practical, without ceremony. She spent those 3 weeks doing what she always did, managing the household, keeping the ledger books her father never looked at, and riding the perimeter of the mine property every other day to check the fence posts and the drainage culverts, because if she didn't do it, no one would. She was the kind of woman a man overlooked until something went wrong. Then suddenly, she was indispensable. The morning Caleb Hurst was expected, Clara had ridden out early to check the northeast fence line, where coyotes had been digging under the posts. She'd spotted a section of collapsed fencing and had dismounted to drag the rotted post back upright, her hands bleeding slightly from the wire. She was mid-repair when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up. A man on a black horse had pulled to a stop 20 feet away, watching her. His coat was well cut. His face was angular, tan from travel, with dark eyes that were evaluating rather than merely looking. A thin scar crossed his left jaw, too precise to be an accident, too old to be recent. "You're on Voss land," Clara said. She didn't stand up from her crouch. She kept her grip on the fence wire. "I know," the man said. "I was invited." She looked at him again. Longer this time. "You're Caleb Hurst," she said. "I am." A pause. "And you're the wrong sister," she said flatly, and went back to fixing the fence. He didn't ride away. He sat on that horse for a long, quiet moment. Then, to her considerable irritation, he dismounted, rolled up his coat sleeve, and crouched beside her. "Hand me the post," he said. She stared at him. He stared back. Not unkindly. With something closer to curiosity, like a man who had encountered something genuinely unexpected and found it more interesting than whatever he'd been planning to find. She handed him the post. They fixed the fence together in near silence, while a mile down the road, in the grandest house in Redstone, Eleanor Voss stood in her blue dress and waited for a man who was already running late. By the time Caleb Hurst arrived at the Voss house that afternoon, he had already made up his mind about something. Nobody at the table that evening could have guessed what it was. But Clara, sitting at the far end of the table in her plain dress with her wire-cut hands folded in her lap, had seen something in those dark eyes that made her chest feel tight in a way she didn't entirely understand. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Dinner at the Voss house that evening was the most elaborate performance Clara had witnessed in years, and she had witnessed some truly desperate ones. Her father had polished his boots and combed his gray hair and become, for the duration of the meal, a version of himself that existed only when money was present. Warm. Jovial. Expansive. A man of vision and forward-thinking and deep frontier wisdom. He told stories about the mine that were true in their broad strokes and optimistic in their details, and he poured Caleb's wine himself, which was something Clara had never seen him do for any guest. Eleanor was luminous. That was the only word. She wore the blue dress and she laughed at the right moments and listened with the kind of attention that made a man feel like the most interesting person alive. And she was so practiced at it that it looked entirely natural. Clara knew it wasn't natural. She'd watched Eleanor rehearse conversations in the mirror. She'd heard her older sister recite answers to imagined questions in her bedroom the night before, the way an actress rehearses lines. None of that was cruelty. Eleanor wanted what she'd been raised to want. She wanted security, position, and a man who could provide both. There was nothing wrong with any of that, and Clara had never judged her for it. What Clara judged, quietly, internally, with a restraint that had calcified into habit over many years, was her father's specific brand of desperation. The way he steered every conversation back to the mine. The way he watched Caleb's face for signs of interest, the way a man watches storm clouds for rain. The way he had positioned his daughters on the table like serving dishes, each one presented as a different course. Clara had been placed at the far end of the table. Not forgotten, exactly. Just deprioritized. Which was normal. Which was fine. Which Clara had accepted with the quiet pragmatism that defined her approach to everything in her life. Except that Caleb kept looking at her. Not openly. Not inappropriately. Small glances, quick and measuring. When her father said something inflated about the mine's projected yield, Caleb's eyes cut briefly to Clara, as though checking her expression for confirmation. when Eleanor made a graceful comment about Redstone's growth potential. Caleb nodded and smiled and then looked again at the woman at the far end of the table who was eating her meal with quiet concentration. After dinner, her father led Caleb to the study to discuss figures. Eleanor excused herself to the parlor. Clara cleared the table because the housekeeper had gone home at sundown, and then she went to the kitchen to wash the plates. She was elbow-deep in soapy water when she heard the study door open. Footsteps in the hall. Then, to her complete surprise, footsteps into the kitchen. She turned around. Caleb stood in the doorway, still in his good coat, holding a wine glass that hadn't been fully emptied. "Your father says the eastern vein is producing 40% above last year's yield," he said. Clara held his gaze. "My father says a lot of things. The ledger in the desk drawer tells a different story." She went very still. "You looked at the ledger." "He left me alone in the study for 10 minutes. A pause. "I tend to look at things when I'm left alone." "And what did you find?" He set the glass on the kitchen table and looked at her with those evaluating eyes. "I found numbers that match what I've been hearing from other sources. The mine is declining. Another 18 months and it's effectively finished." He paused. "I also found a second ledger in the back of the drawer. Smaller. With handwriting that isn't your father's." Clara said nothing. She turned back to the dishes. "You've been tracking the real numbers," he said. Not a question. "For how long?" 2 years, she said, not turning around. A long silence stretched through the kitchen. Outside, a coyote called somewhere distant, and the oil lamp on the counter guttered in a draft. "Why?" he asked finally. "What are you planning to do with the information?" She turned then. Looked at him squarely. "I was going to find a way to transition the property before the collapse. Switch to cattle. The land is good for it. The infrastructure is already there, half of it." She paused. "But that requires capital my father doesn't have and won't ask for because he refuses to admit there's a problem." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It had a different texture. Like the moment before a deal is made or a card is shown. "Tell me the rest," Caleb said. She did. She talked for 40 minutes. Numbers, projections, land surveys, water access, grazing capacity. She talked with the focused specificity of someone who had been carrying a plan alone for so long that speaking it aloud felt like releasing pressure from a valve. He didn't interrupt. He asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, the kind that cut to the structural heart of a plan and test whether the person presenting it actually understands it, or just memorized it. She answered both without hesitating. When she finished, the lamp had burned lower and the kitchen was quieter. He was looking at her differently now. Not the measuring glance from dinner. Something more direct. "Your father," he said carefully, "is expecting me to propose a business arrangement with the family. He's also expecting, I know what he's expecting," Clara said. "Does Eleanor know? That the mine is failing?" "No." "Does she know what he's expecting from this visit?" "She knows she's supposed to make you fall in love with her." Clara kept her voice level. "She doesn't know the mine is the reason you were invited." He nodded slowly. He picked up the wine glass. He looked at it. Then he set it down again. "I'm going to need to think," he said. "Take your time," Clara said. "It's your money." He left the kitchen. She listened to his footsteps go back down the hall and up the stairs to the hotel room her father had arranged, because having Caleb sleep under their roof would be too obvious. But having him sleep somewhere comfortable and close was essential strategy. Clara stood in the kitchen long after the water went cold. She was not thinking about love. She was not thinking about herself at all. She was thinking about what would happen to Redstone when the mine closed. And she was trying very hard not to think about the fact that Caleb Hurst was the first person who had ever asked her to explain her plan. The next 3 days moved at 2 different speeds. On the surface, in the visible life of the Voss house and the wider gossip of Redstone, things moved slowly and pleasantly. Caleb took Eleanor riding. He attended a dinner at the mayor's house, where Eleanor sat beside him and shone. He walked through the mine with Douglas Voss while the foreman gave figures that were technically accurate and strategically incomplete. He toured the property on horseback, smiled at the right people, said little of consequence, and gave every outward sign of a man being courted in the proper manner and not finding it disagreeable. Beneath that surface, things moved fast. Each evening, between 9 o'clock and 11, Clara met Caleb in the kitchen. It had not been arranged. It had simply happened, the second night, after the mayor's dinner. Clara had been up late updating the cattle transition plans when she heard the back door open and found him there with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and his expression carrying the weight of a man who had been performing all day and needed somewhere to stop. They worked. That was all it was, Clara told herself. They worked. She spread maps on the kitchen table. He provided information about land purchase prices in adjacent counties. She calculated grazing capacity. He knew 3 cattle ranchers in the territory who might partner on a transition operation. She had already identified the 2 strongest fence lines that could be repurposed. He had contacts at the railroad. Of course he did, his father's railroad, who could arrange a shipping contract. What they were building, across those late-night kitchen sessions, was not romantic. It was a survival plan for a town that didn't know it was dying. Clara told herself that repeatedly. On the third evening, Caleb arrived looking different. Tighter around the jaw. He set a folded piece of paper on the table before she could say anything. "Someone knows about our meetings," he said. She went cold. "Eleanor?" "No." He pushed the paper toward her. "Someone left this in my room at the hotel." She unfolded it. The handwriting was crude, unsigned. The message was short. "You're being played. Ask her what she did to the last man who tried to help this family." She read it twice. Her expression didn't change, but her hands did, the faintest tension in her fingers before she smoothed them flat on the table. "Who gave you this?" she asked. "No one gave it to me. It was slipped under my door." She folded it carefully and set it down. "That's Vickers," she said. "Frank Vickers. He's the mine foreman. He's also been skimming operational funds for the last 4 years. If the mine transitions to cattle, he loses his position and his income source. That explains his motive," Caleb said. "It doesn't answer the question." She looked up at him. "What happened to the last man who tried to help this family?" The lamp between them threw uneven shadows. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of distant rain that would probably miss them entirely, as rain always did in this part of Texas. Clara was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. "His name was Thomas Ardell," she said at last. "He was a surveyor. He came out here 2 years before I started keeping the second ledger. He was investigating the land for a water access deal that would have benefited the town. He identified the actual state of the mine's decline in the process." A pause. "My father didn't like that." "What did your father do?" "My father did nothing." She said it carefully, like each word was a stone she was placing precisely. "My father told his foreman, Frank Vickers, that the surveyor's findings were inconvenient. And Vickers handled the inconvenience." The air in the kitchen changed. "Handled," Caleb repeated. "Thomas Ardell left Redstone on a Tuesday. His horse came back riderless on the Wednesday. They found him 3 days later in a ravine 9 miles east, with a head wound consistent with a fall from a horse. She let that sit. I was 15. I saw the horse come back. I watched my father's face when they told him." Another pause. He wasn't surprised. He was relieved. And then he arranged his face properly. "And Vickers?" Caleb asked quietly. "Got a raise." Silence. "You were 15, Caleb said. "And you've known this since you were 15. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell who?" Clara said. Not sharply. Not bitterly. Just with the flat exhaustion of someone who has asked themselves the same question enough times to know the answer by heart. Tell the sheriff, who drinks with my father every Friday? Tell the circuit judge who came through twice and both times stayed in the house on the hill and ate at our table? Tell someone in a town that runs on the mine that the mine owner's daughter was accusing the mine foreman of murder based on a 15-year-old's interpretation of her father's face? She gathered the map she'd been working on and rolled it with careful hands. I have been building a plan to save this town without my father or Vickers being able to stop it, she said. That requires capital from outside the town, someone my father can't control. And it transitioned fast enough that Vickers doesn't have time to sabotage it before it becomes irreversible. She looked at him. That is why I am talking to you in this kitchen every night. I need a partner, not a rescuer. And I need someone who understands what they're walking into. Caleb was very still. You should have told me this on the first night, he said. I needed to know if you were worth telling, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the folded note from the table and tucked it into his coat. Vickers is going to move before the deal can be made, he said. He's already spooked. I know. Then we're out of time. She nodded once. Her expression hadn't changed throughout the entire conversation. But her eyes, those quiet, enduring eyes, held something beneath the composure. Something that had been held in reserve for a very long time, behind the competence, and the pragmatism and the careful ledger books. Fear. Not for herself. For what Vickers was capable of. And for how little stood between him and the thing Clara had spent 2 years quietly trying to prevent. What do you want to do? Caleb asked. She opened her mouth to answer. And then the back door crashed open, and Frank Vickers walked in with 2 men behind him, and a rifle leveled at the space between them. Vickers was a big man who had spent 20 years becoming exactly as mean as the land he worked. He had a miner's hands, broad, cracked, permanently gray at the knuckles, and a foreman's eyes, which were the eyes of a man who had learned that the surest way to keep your position was to make yourself indispensable through fear rather than competence. He was not stupid. He was cunning in the specific, dangerous way of men who have operated without consequence long enough to confuse impunity with invincibility. He stood in the doorway of the Voss kitchen with the rifle and 2 hired men, and he looked at Clara and Caleb across the table full of maps and ledgers and plans. And he smiled the smile of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them satisfactory. Burning the midnight oil, he said. Put the rifle down, Vickers, Clara said. Her voice was level. She had, Caleb would later reflect, the particular composure of someone who has already imagined this moment. I don't think so. He stepped into the kitchen. His men fanned out. I think what we have here is a conversation. A productive one. About what happens next. Caleb's hand had moved, a small, almost involuntary motion, toward his hip. Your gun is hanging by the back door, Vickers said pleasantly. You took it off when you came in. I watched through the window. A pause. I've been watching a lot of things. What do you want? Caleb asked. I want the deal to die, Vickers said. I want you to ride back to St. Louis or wherever you came from and take your railroad money and your questions with you. And I want the ledger. He looked at Clara. Both of them. The ledgers are already copied, Clara said. 3 times. In 3 locations. The smile flickered. Just briefly. You're bluffing. I'm careful, she said. There's a difference. The kitchen held for a moment in a kind of loaded stillness, the particular silence of a room where violence is possible, and no one is sure who will make it real. Then Caleb moved. Not toward his gun. Toward the table. He gathered the maps, deliberately, without hurry, rolled them, and tucked them under his arm. He looked at Vickers with an expression Clara would later describe as professionally unimpressed. I'm going to walk out of here, he said. And in the morning I'm going to have a conversation with your employer about restructuring the operational leadership of this property. He paused. You can shoot me in the back, which will end whatever protection you've enjoyed from Douglas Voss. Or you can let me leave and spend tonight deciding whether there's a version of what comes next in which you don't go to prison. Vickers laughed. But it was the wrong kind of laugh, too quick, covering something. You think Voss will back you over me? I think Douglas Voss cares about one thing above everything else, Caleb said. And that thing is not you. He walked to the back door. He picked up his gun belt from the hook. He strapped it on without any theatrical slowness, just competent habit. He opened the door. Then he stopped and looked back at Clara. Come with me, he said. She looked at him. Then at Vickers. Then at the maps on the table, the remaining ones, the ones she hadn't yet memorized. The ledgers, she said. Leave them. I can't, Clara. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. Leave them. Something passed across her face, a surrender of a very specific kind, the kind that costs something real. Then she walked to the door. Vickers raised the rifle. You walk out that door, he said, and I will burn this place down. You'll burn your employer's house down, Caleb said, over a business dispute. In front of witnesses. He glanced at the two hired men behind Vickers, boys really, 19 or 20, who were looking at each other with the edgy uncertainty of people who had signed up for intimidation and hadn't prepared for arson. How much is he paying you? He asked them directly. Whatever it is, I'll triple it. Tomorrow morning. Bank draft. One of the boys lowered his rifle. The other looked at Vickers. Vickers' face had gone through several colors in quick succession. He was recalculating. He was a man whose entire power base was the mine and the authority it gave him, and that authority was currently disintegrating in real time in the kitchen where he thought he held every card. He made his decision. He swung the rifle toward Clara instead of Caleb, the softer target, the pressure point, the lever. Caleb had already moved. The rifle went off. The shot went wide and buried itself in the kitchen wall. The oil lamp shattered and the kitchen plunged into sudden darkness broken only by the glow of embers from the cook stove. In the dark and the chaos and the smoke, Caleb had Clara's hand. They ran. Through the back garden. Through the fence gate. Across the dry field behind the house to where he'd left the black stallion tied to a cottonwood, because Caleb Hurst, it turned out, had been a cautious man long before he'd ever come to Redstone. He pulled her up behind him. They rode. Not toward town. Away from it, into the dark badlands north of the property, where the rock formations rose like broken teeth against the sky and the ground was hard enough to disguise hoofprints. They rode for an hour without speaking, and behind them, the Voss house stayed dark and unburned, and the town of Redstone stayed asleep and unaware. In the Badlands they stopped. Clara's hands, gripping his coat in the dark, were shaking, not with fear, precisely, but with the aftershock of adrenaline in a body that had held itself composed for too long. We have to go back, she said. Not tonight. Eleanor doesn't know. Eleanor will be fine tonight, he said. Vickers needs the house. He won't touch anyone inside it. He looked back over his shoulder at her. In the moonlight, her face was pale and precise and exhausted. Are you hurt? No, she said. Then rest, he said. We ride back at dawn. Everything happens in the morning. She didn't rest. She sat against the base of a rock formation in the cold night air and watched the stars and thought about Thomas Ardell and the 2 years she'd spent building a plan for a town that had never asked for her help and had never offered her any in return. Caleb sat a few feet away and watched the dark horizon. Why are you still doing this? He asked after a while. You could leave. You have the skills. The plans. You could take them somewhere else. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. Because when the mine closes, she said finally, the people who suffer won't be my father. They won't be Vickers. They'll be the miners and the shopkeepers and the families who built lives here because someone told them this place had a future. She paused. Someone should have told them the truth 2 years ago. I'm trying to make that true without destroying what's left in the process. Caleb said nothing for a while. Then, I'm going to invest in the cattle transition. She looked at him. The full plan. Your plan. He was quiet for a moment. I've looked at dozens of investment opportunities in the last 2 years. I've never met anyone who understood a problem as completely as you understand this one. Another pause. And I've never met anyone who was doing it for the right reasons. The night around them was vast and cold and absolutely silent except for the wind. This doesn't solve Vickers, Clara said. No, he agreed. That's a different problem. And we handle it in the morning. She nodded once. She looked back at the stars. You're a strange man, she said. You're the second person to tell me that this week, he said. The first was your sister. Clara almost smiled. Almost. What exactly do you intend to tell my father when we ride back? She asked. Caleb looked at the horizon, where the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate sky from earth. The truth, he said. All of it. They rode back into Redstone at first light, when the sky was pale orange and the main street was empty except for a stray dog and the smell of someone's morning fire. The town woke up to find them. By the time they reached the Voss house, the street had filled. Word had moved the way word always moves in small towns, faster than horses, slower than rumors deserve, and by the time Caleb brought the black stallion to a stop in front of the gate, there were 30 people watching. Then 40. Douglas Voss stood on his porch in his shirt sleeves, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who is enraged and afraid and trying to present both as dignity. Beside him, 2 steps back, Eleanor stood in a robe with her hair loose, her face perfectly composed in the way that Clara recognized as her sister's version of survival mode. Frank Vickers was nowhere visible. That absence was louder than anything else. Caleb dismounted. He helped Clara down, and the crowd's murmur rose and fell like a wave. He turned to face Douglas Voss. We need to have a conversation, he said. All of us. Including the sheriff. The sheriff is already here, said a voice from the edge of the crowd. Sheriff Marrow stepped forward. He was 62, gray-bearded, and had the look of a man who had spent a great deal of his career choosing what not to see. He looked at Clara with a particular expression, not quite guilt, not quite defensiveness. Something between. Mr. Hurst, he said. There was apparently a disturbance at the Voss property last night. Frank Vickers filed a complaint this morning saying, Vickers filed a complaint, Caleb said. He claims he found you and Miss Clara trespassing in the house and sheriff, Caleb said. He kept his voice level and unhurried, the voice, Clara thought, of a man who had learned that composure was more effective than volume. I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it carefully. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. This morning, before we rode back, I sent a telegraph from the station at Millhaven. This is the confirmation. He held it up. I've engaged 2 Pinkerton agents from Fort Worth. They are currently en route to Redstone. Their assignment is to investigate the death of a surveyor named Thomas Ardell who disappeared from this area approximately 7 years ago. The murmur from the crowd shifted in pitch. Several people looked at each other. Douglas Voss had gone the color of ash. Now, Caleb continued, tucking the document away, you can handle this properly, or you can allow me to handle it through channels you won't enjoy. He looked at the sheriff. I'm asking you to do your job. And I'm asking you to start by finding Frank Vickers. Marrow stared at him. Stared at Clara. Stared at Voss on the porch. Something moved behind the sheriff's eyes, something that might have been the memory of a Tuesday 7 years ago when a horse came back riderless, and a young man's body was found in a ravine. And the mine foreman got a raise, and Sheriff Merrow had chosen what not to see. He cleared his throat. "Men," he said to his two deputies. "Find Vickers." The crowd parted. Douglas Voss had not moved from the porch. He was looking at Clara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not dismissal. Something rawer than either of those, something that might have been the first honest feeling he'd shown her in 20 years. "You did this," he said. His voice was low and strange. "I tried to tell you 2 years ago," she said. "You weren't listening. You brought a stranger into. I brought someone who could save this town into it," she said. "Because you couldn't. Because you wouldn't admit there was anything to save it from." She stood at the gate of his house and looked at him on his porch, and her voice was even and irrevocable. "I love this place, Father. I love it despite everything. And I am going to do what needs doing, whether you accept it or not." Eleanor had come down from the porch. She stood beside her father now, watching Clara with an expression that Clara couldn't immediately decode. Not anger, she'd expected anger. Not betrayal, exactly. Something more complicated. She walked toward Clara. The crowd went very quiet. Eleanor stopped 2 feet away. She looked at her sister, really looked, the way people look at each other when they've stopped maintaining the agreed-upon version of things. "How long?" Eleanor asked. 2 years building the plan," Clara said. 7 years knowing about Ardell. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted in her face, a subtle reconfiguration, like a room that looks the same but has been fundamentally rearranged. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I would have, I know," Clara said again. Softer this time. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She looked at Caleb. "And you," she said. "You've made your choice quite clear." "Miss Voss," Caleb said. "I came to Redstone to find a sound investment. I found one. The person who created it was your sister." He paused. "I'm sorry that isn't what anyone expected." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a composure that was entirely her own and earned on the spot rather than rehearsed, she straightened her robe and looked back at her father. "You should go inside," she told him, not unkindly. He went. A shout from the far end of town broke the moment open. Then another. They found Frank Vickers behind the livery stable, saddling a horse with the desperate efficiency of a man who knows the window for escape is closing. He had a rifle and a pistol and a canvas saddlebag whose contents, they would discover later, included 5 years of skimmed mine payroll, organized in rubber-banded bundles with the careful precision of a man who'd always known this day might come. He didn't make it out of the stable. He made it 3 steps toward the door before Sheriff Merrow's deputies blocked both exits. And the moment stretched for a beat, the particular held breath of a man calculating whether the odds favor a fight, and then Frank Vickers looked at the rifles, and the men holding them, and the crowd visible through the open stable doors, and the calculating, indispensable intelligence behind his eyes performed its final calculation. He set his rifle down. He put his hands up. And across town, in the kitchen of the Voss house where 2 months' worth of covert planning had happened in the small hours, the ledger book sat open on the table, Clara's handwriting. Column after column, 2 years of painstaking honesty about a situation everyone else had agreed to pretend was fine. It would be the primary evidence in the trial. That, and the testimony of a woman who had been 15 years old when she watched a horse come home without its rider, and had spent 7 years deciding what to do about it. The trial of Frank Vickers lasted 4 days and took place in Fort Worth. Because Redstone's courthouse was a converted storage room and the circuit judge determined that proceedings of this nature required more space and less conflict of interest. Douglas Voss was not charged. There was insufficient direct evidence to connect him to Ardell's death, only Clara's testimony about his expression on the day they found the body, which any defense attorney worth his salt would have dismantled in under an hour. He knew it. Clara knew it. Caleb knew it. The verdict on Vickers was 15 years. The judge might have given more, but Thomas Ardell had no surviving family to advocate for a harsher sentence, and 7 years of deteriorating evidence left gaps that Vickers' lawyer, a dry and patient man from Dallas, had exploited with professional precision. Clara sat through every day of the trial in the gallery, upright and still, with the specific endurance of someone who has expected disappointment and has decided to witness the partial justice anyway, because partial justice is still something. Caleb sat beside her. This was noted. This was talked about. The story, as it traveled through the frontier telegraph of gossip and rumor, became many different stories depending on who was telling it. In some versions, Caleb had rescued Clara from danger. In others, Clara had manipulated a rich man into advancing her agenda. In still others, they were both conspirators against a good family who had simply fallen on hard times. The truth, as usual, was less dramatic and more human than any of those versions. Redstone itself changed in ways that happened slowly enough that no single day felt significant, and then, looking back from a distance, felt like everything. The mine continued operating for 14 more months, not 40% above yield, but not immediately catastrophically either. The honest numbers, once acknowledged, allowed for a managed decline rather than a collapse. Caleb's investment, structured through a land purchase and a cattle infrastructure deal rather than the mine itself, began building in parallel. By the time the silver finally ran thin enough to be undeniable, the first Voss cattle herd was already grazing on the eastern pastures. And a shipping contract with the railroad was signed and operational. 32 mining families transitioned to ranch work. 11 more found employment in the expanded infrastructure, fencing, water management, equipment maintenance, that the cattle operation required. 6 chose to leave Redstone entirely, which was their right, and Clara had quietly calculated that number into her projections and built enough flexibility to absorb it. The town survived. Not triumphantly. Not without pain. But it survived in the specific, unglamorous way of places that choose adaptation over pride, and that was a kind of victory worth counting. Douglas Voss died 11 months after the trial. His heart, the doctor said. Clara sat with him in the final days, not because she had forgiven everything, she hadn't, but because she understood that forgiveness and presence were different things. And the latter was something she could offer without the former. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. But on the second to last night, when the lamp was low and his breathing had gone shallow and the house was very quiet, he looked at her and said, with some difficulty, "You always knew what this place needed." She didn't answer. But she stayed until morning. Eleanor surprised everyone, including herself. In the immediate aftermath of the trial and the transition, Eleanor could have retreated into bitterness or performance, or both. She had been raised to expect a certain kind of life and had watched it restructure itself around circumstances she hadn't chosen. That was grounds for a particular species of ruin. Instead, she asked Clara to show her the ledgers. Not the old ones. The new ones. The cattle operations books, the land surveys, the shipping projections. She sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen, and worked through them with Clara over 3 evenings, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd evening she said, with some astonishment, "I'm good at this." She was. She had an instinct for numbers that had been submerged under years of preparation for a life that was primarily social and decorative. Given actual work, it surfaced with startling efficiency. She became the bookkeeper for the cattle operation. Then the operations manager. Then, 5 years later, the person in Redstone that ranchers across the territory came to when they needed someone who understood both the land and the money with equal precision. She never married. She told Clara once, in a tone that was more liberated than bitter, that she found she preferred competence to courtship. And that discovering you were capable of running something real tended to make the performance of helplessness feel unbearable. Caleb Hurst did not stay in Redstone permanently. This was a thing people later got wrong, either from romance or from a need for a cleaner story. He came and went. His railroad interests and investment portfolio required movement, required presence in cities that Redstone would never be. He was there for the first cattle drive. He was absent for 3 months in the spring of the second year when a deal in Kansas required his attention. He returned. He left again. He returned again. He and Clara did not have the kind of courtship that happened in parlors. What they had happened in the spaces between things. On horseback along the fence lines she rode every other day, out of habit and because the work still needed doing. In telegrams that were longer than necessary and contained information that was mostly a pretext for communication. In the kitchen, when he was in town, with maps and ledgers and coffee that she made badly and that he drank without complaint. He proposed twice. The first time, Clara said she needed to think about it, and spent 2 months thinking, and then said yes. The wedding was small by the standards of what people in town had imagined for a rich man's ceremony. Clara wore a dress in a blue that was closer to gray, which suited her. Eleanor stood beside her. The sheriff who had spent a career choosing what not to see attended and shook Clara's hand afterward with the particular solemnity of a man making a private and partial amends. The final thing about Redstone, the thing that became the story the town told about itself in later years. The founding myth of a place that had learned to survive, was not about the mine or the cattle or the trial. It was about a fence. On the northeast corner of what had been the Voss property, now operating under the name the Hearst-Voss Land Company. A name that had caused 3 weeks of argument before everyone agreed it was accurate. There was a section of fence that Clara had repaired on the morning she met Caleb. She never replaced that section. When the posts rotted, she replaced those specifically, and kept the wire. When the staples rusted, she replaced those. But the fence line itself, that particular corner, she maintained with the specific attention she gave to things she didn't want to lose. Years later, when a journalist from a newspaper in San Antonio came to write about what had happened in Redstone, he asked her about it. Why that fence? Why keep it? She thought about it for a moment, standing in the midday heat with her wire-cut hands and her ledger under her arm, looking at the section of fencing that had started something neither of them had planned. Because it was the first thing we fixed together, she said. And because everything that came after needed to come from somewhere real. The journalist wrote that down. He also asked her, because journalists always do, whether she thought justice had been served. About Vickers, about her father, about the surveyor who had died in a ravine, and whose name most people in Redstone had never known. Clara was quiet for a long time. Thomas Ardell deserved better than what he got, she said. A lot of people did. Justice is not the same thing as what they deserved. It's just what was possible. She looked at the fence. I've learned not to confuse the two. It keeps you from becoming someone who needs the world to be perfect before they can do any good in it. She walked back toward the house. At the gate, she stopped without turning around. He picked the right sister, she said. But that's not the story. The story is that this town needed someone to see it clearly enough to save it. A pause. That happened to be me. It almost wasn't. That's the part that keeps me up at night. She went inside. The fence stood in the afternoon sun, ordinary and maintained and holding. In the end, Redstone did not become great. It did not boom. It did not attract speculators or railroad barons or the kind of violent, golden chaos that made other frontier towns legendary. It became something quieter and rarer, a place that endured. A place that chose honesty over comfort, eventually, and paid the price of that choice, and found the price was survivable. The people who stayed built lives on ground that had been stripped of its comfortable illusions and was therefore, finally, real enough to stand on. Thomas Ardell's name was added to the small marker in the Redstone cemetery that listed the town's dead. The stone was simple. Clara had paid for it herself. Eleanor Voss ran the books of the most successful cattle operation in that part of Texas for 30 years, and when young women came to her asking how she'd done it, she told them the truth. Which was this: find out what you're actually good at, not what you were told to be good at. The first will sustain you. The second will hollow you out. Caleb Hurst was, by most accounts, a good man. Not a perfect one. He was impatient, occasionally arrogant, and had a tendency to believe he could solve with money what required time. Clara told him this, regularly, without softening it, and he listened most of the time. That was enough. That was more than enough. And Clara herself? She was still writing the fence lines the year she turned 60. Still updating the ledgers. Still the person everyone came to when something was broken or unclear or about to fail, not because she had the most money or the most charm or the most beauty, but because she had what was rarer than any of those things. She could see a thing as it actually was. And she could stay with it, patiently and without self-pity, until it became what it needed to be. A rich cowboy had ridden into a dying town and chosen the woman nobody expected. But Clara Voss had already chosen Redstone long before anyone chose her. And that, in the end, was the only choice that mattered. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen. Others spend their lives making sure the work gets done whether anyone is watching or not. The world calls the first kind special. It survives because of the second kind.